Hey, everybody. Thank you for tuning into this new series that I'm putting together. We've been doing a lot of discussion as a body, as the community of Christ on the kingdom of God, what it is, what it means to be a citizen of the kingdom. And this is an aspect that frankly is overlooked a lot of in these kingdom discussions, at least the groups that I've been around, and it is the calendar in God's kingdom, his kingdom calendar. What are the days that are special to him on his calendar? And so we're going to start off this kingdom festival series, starting with the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread through the lens of Jesus. And I'm excited to get to do this right now during this Passover season, even though we're right at the end of it. I'm filming this on the last day of the festival of unleavened bread, and we'll talk about that. If you don't know what that terminology means, we'll discuss that in this series. But yeah, we're at the end of the festival right now. But the cool thing is, or it's not, I don't know, I guess you're reckoning of what cool is. But we do have a plague going on around the world right now, and we have people that have celebrated the Passover here this week. They've done it, most people, as individuals in their homes. It's just their own tight knit families for the first time in history since the original Passover, where there was a plague that was going on outside their houses as they were eating the lamb and as they were celebrating it for the first time. The same thing has been going on around the world today for those who have been celebrating this kingdom festival. And but the cool thing is as well is that for those who are unclean at the time of Passover, there is a second Passover that can be celebrated a month later. And that's what I'm looking forward to, is next month being able to celebrate Passover all over again, as communities are going to get to come together, hopefully, prayerfully, when this plague has been disbanded and we're able to begin to come together in fellowship again. And we'll be able to do it next month once the uncleanness has been removed from the land. So anyways, that's a little bit of a prophetic, overtone. Hopefully that's what's going to happen. But for right now, anyways, I'm excited to look into this Passover series with you and to study this out together, because Jesus and the Passover, what does it mean for Jesus even to be our Passover lamb? And there's just so much symbolism. I'm excited to share this with you. So let's go ahead and dive right in. I'm going to go ahead and close out my window for right now, my webcam, and we're just going to go ahead and dive into this video series. So here we go. I apologize. There we go. So why study the Passover? Well, Jesus is described as our Passover lamb, right? What does this even mean? What does it mean that Jesus is our Passover lamb? Why do we need a new Passover, right? We already have a Passover from Egypt, right? That set us free from slavery to Egypt. So why do we need a new Passover? What do the elements of the Last Supper mean in the context of the Passover Seder? And if you're not totally sure what the Passover Seder is, we're going to discuss that, go over that in this series. But the Seder basically is a meal that was put together, started off with instructions and scriptures, and then eventually it got tradition got involved, and we created an elaborate meal to discuss the elements of the freedom from our slavery. And but what does that mean when Jesus and his disciples were eating this Passover Seder that eventually became the Last Supper? What did the elements mean in this context of a Passover Seder? The bread and the wine, right? We need to study Passover to dispel the myths in our modern theology surrounding Passover, which we're going to go ahead and do right up front, to go ahead and answer maybe some of these questions that are in your mind right now. Like, why does it even matter? Yeah, maybe a festival of God, but I mean, really, like, it doesn't have anything to do with our faith today. Well, let's discuss some of these ideas in our modern theology and see if that's true. And we also want to grow ultimately in a deeper love for God by just recognizing another layer of his deep love for us. And I'm going to submit, if he gave us his festivals, right? If he really gave us these festivals, it's because of his love for us. He gives good things, right? Every good and precious gift comes down from the Father of lights, right? So amazing. Let's go ahead and dive right into this then. God's calendar. Let's just get a little introduction to the fact that God even has a calendar, right? Genesis 1:14. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years." So if you're like me, the first time I ever read through Genesis and I'm reading this term seasons here, my thought was initially spring, summer, fall, and winter, right? What if I told you that's not necessarily what the Hebrew word here, which is moedim, that's not what the meaning of this word here is in this context that God gave it to us. So what does it mean? Let's go look. Moedim is Strong's number H4150. It's properly an appointment. It's a fixed time or season, specifically a festival, right? By implication, it's an assembly as convened for a definite purpose. It can mean the congregation. By extension, the place of a meeting can be a signal as appointed beforehand, a signal, an appointed sign or a time, a congregation, again, a feast, right? Season, solemnity, synagogue, right? So it has a lot of these different definitions here, but primarily it's an appointment or a festival or a feast, specifically an assembly. God put the stars and the sun and moon in the skies to show us when we're supposed to meet with him, right? And so I'm gonna put my face back up here so you can see me here, and you can see my heart, right, pouring into you in this. He gave us his signs in the heavens so that we can know when he desires to meet with us. Did you know that God desires to meet with his people, and he has specific times and seasons when he wants us to meet with him that are more special than the everyday coming to him? Yes, God wants us to come to him every morning and every evening in prayer. He wants us to come to worship, on Sundays, because that's the established tradition in our society, is to come together on a Sunday morning and maybe a Wednesday evening. But did you know that on God's calendar, he has specific times that he wants to meet with us, that he has set in order? And because he's God, he can do that. And he probably has a very good reason for giving us festivals and for giving us these appointed time, these holy days. And so it's like this. This is a good analogy that I've heard that was shared with me by an old pastor of mine. So having an anniversary, right? You have an anniversary with your spouse. So you don't miss the anniversary that you have with your spouse. I mean, every day of the year is supposed to be special, right? But you don't miss their anniversary. You don't miss their birthday. Those you definitely remember, right? Or they're probably going to be kind of, pretty upset with you, even though you love them every other day of the year. You may even give them a gift every other day of the year, but forget giving them a gift or some way of acknowledging to them that you remember their birthday and you remember your anniversary together. That's not going to be good. Even if you're on a different calendar, even if, our world, we operate in a Western world on the Gregorian calendar, but say I go to her and say, I think I'm just going to start celebrating or observing the Julian calendar, from the Roman days, or I'm going to, maybe celebrate the Hebrew calendar, and I'm going to totally forget the Gregorian calendar, even though that is our normal calendar for society. She may be okay with that, but she probably would be pretty upset, or he, like I say, he as well, would be pretty upset if you're on a new calendar, but you forget your anniversary or forget their birthday on the Gregorian calendar, right? Like the calendar that they're used to. If our earthly spouse would be upset over such a negligence on our part, how much more our Heavenly Father when we neglect the times and seasons he set up for us? And I submit, he shows up on those days in powerful ways. And in fact, there's many prophets throughout the world today, people that truly have a prophetic voice. Bruce Allen being one of them, and there's several others, but God speaks to them and meets with them with specific revelations, amazing revelations, throne room experiences on his special holy days, right? Maybe because there's a special purpose there that God has ordained for us. And so we need to get a revelation of what these days are and prepare our hearts to meet with him on these days. So what do these days look like? Here's just a few of them. Again, closing my screen out here. These are just a few of the days. In the spring, his spring festivals are holy days. We have Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and Pentecost. Those terminologies might be familiar to you as you if you know the New Testament pretty well. And I submit Jesus actually fulfilled many of these days, the spring festivals, and these holy days, at his first coming. Like what these festivals were pointing to, a deeper revelation of why I gave them to us, was to show us the full redemption that's going to come in our Messiah. And he did that, right? In his first coming, fulfilling the first four of these festivals. But did you know that there's also some festivals that take place in the fall? We have trumpets, we have the Day of Atonements, we have tabernacles, and one I didn't list here because it's more of a smaller level. I mean, and I say smaller level, it's not talked about as much in Scripture as a separate day from tabernacles, but there's also what's called the last great day. It's the 8th day of tabernacles, and there's a lot of symbolism there as well that I should have added to here. But how do you, I mean, do you recognize, or do you know that these last fall festivals, these last festivals and holy days, they're to be fulfilled at Jesus' second coming? There's specific events that have been designed in this great redemption plan through Jesus that are going to be fulfilled at this second coming. And if we don't understand God's times and seasons, we're going to miss and misunderstand a huge part of the redemption plan. And we're also going to miss, if you will, the second coming. We're not going to know when he's on his way. He tells us we're to understand times and seasons, right? And let me just turn here real quick. I didn't add the scripture here, but it's just coming to mind. It's in Thessalonians, and I believe it's second. Maybe this is not the right time to try to look this up right now while we're talking. But actually, here it is. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. He says, but concerning the times, chapter 5, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 1, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 1 says, but concerning the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I should write to you. Now, concerning the times and seasons of what? Well, the last chapter was talking about the second coming of Christ, and when the second coming is going to take place and the resurrection from the dead. He says, for you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night, right? The second coming of the Lord comes as a thief in the night. For when they, the world, says peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. Now, verse 4 is key. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, so that this day should overtake you as a thief. You are all sons of light and sons of the day. You are not of the night, nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. He's saying, brethren, the times and seasons I do not need to write to you. You are not in the darkness. You're in the light. You're going to know when the second coming is going to happen. It's not going to overtake you as a thief. And how many of you know it's been taught in dispensational, theology, end times, the idea is that the day of the Lord's coming as a thief, and we're not going to know when it's going to happen. And the rapture, or the second coming can take place at any time, just any time, and where no one's going to know when it's going to take place. And yet the Bible speaks differently. Paul says it's not going to overtake us as a thief. We're going to know because we're going to know the times and the seasons. What seasons? What times? I submit to you God's calendar right here. When we understand it, we're going to know. So we're going to get into all that second coming stuff. My goal is to do some videos on each one of these days and discuss more of the significance of the festivals and Jesus's coming in the first festivals, and then speculation about the second coming and what it's going to look like in the fall festivals and what that looks like. But first off, we're here to discuss Passover in this video series. So let's get right to it, okay? Here's a quick picture now of just a little bit of the calendar so you can kind of get an idea, because we are on a Gregorian system, a system that, runs, from January, February, March, and all that. Well, God's calendar, and I'm going to pull up my little neat little nifty pointer here. God's calendar begins in the month of what's called Nisan, or Aviv in the Hebrew, right? And there's generally 12 months that goes around the year. Sometimes there's a 13th month added because it's a lunar calendar. And each day of the month only has, anywhere from 29 to 30 to 31 days. And our solar calendar that we currently use has 365 days a year. But there's still actually, I think, almost a quarter to a third of a day at the end of each year that we don't count. But that's why we add an extra day in February, a 29th day in February every so often to make up for the day that we lose every few years. Well, the same thing with the Hebrew calendar. There's 12 months, but every so often, every few years, there's a 13th month that's added to make sure that the calendar stays roughly equivalent. It doesn't always follow exactly our calendar as far as, Nisan always begins somewhere in the middle of March. No, it fluctuates. So when the festivals take place, those fluctuate every year. But roughly Passover and unleavened bread, that takes place somewhere here in the spring. And then we're going to have Pentecost after a 50-day period of counting. Takes place sometime in the summer, the early summer, May or June, right? The time of the wheat harvest. And then we're going to have another several months until we get to the beginning of the fall festivals, which begin right here at the month of Tishrei and accumulate here. And then, again, we go throughout the year. And so anyways, it's just a little map to kind of give you a little idea, kind of a visual of what the festivals of the Lord look like. So let's go ahead and get into Passover specifically, okay? I want to answer some of these myths, some of these questions that may be in your mind right now, so that we can go ahead and deal with them right away, and then we can get to the coolness, the amazing revelation I want to get to about Passover and why it should be important to us, how Jesus, walked this out, and what it all means for us today. So the first myth, Passover is a Jewish holiday, and it's not for Gentile believers. Is Passover a Jewish holiday? Is that true? Well, we're going to go ahead and discuss that, okay? The second myth is that the New Testament believers did not celebrate Passover or the other festivals of Yahweh, so therefore we shouldn't either. Is that true? Okay, we're going to find out. Did the New Testament believers celebrate Passover or in the other festivals, right? And the third myth is that Passover has been fulfilled, so therefore we don't need to celebrate it anymore. Okay, we're going to discuss what fulfill means, what that looks like. So let's go ahead and get right to it. Is Passover a Jewish holiday? Let's hop right in. Exodus chapter 12, verse 11 is the first account of Passover. It says, "And thus you shall eat it, with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste, for it is Yahweh's Passover." So whose Passover is it? Is it a Jewish Passover? Is it Israel's Passover? No, it's Yahweh's Passover. It is the Passover of our God, and he invites all to participate, especially the children of the living God. He invites us to participate in his Passover, right? And especially since we know that Jesus is the Passover lamb, I mean, what does it mean to be a Passover lamb if we have no Passover anymore, right? Doesn't make sense. Now, at Mount Sinai, it's commonly taught, well, God gave his festivals and his laws at Mount Sinai, and it was only to Israel, it wasn't to the nations. But did you know that there was a mixed multitude at Mount Sinai? There was 12 tribes of Israel along with a whole mixed multitude. Okay, more than just the Jewish people, got it? All 12 tribes of Israel, right? The Danites, the Benjaminites, the Asherites, and Manasseites, and Ephraimites, and all them, right? Not just the Jewish people, but also, from the tribe of Judah, but also a whole mixed multitude. All these Gentiles who came out of Egypt with Israel, they too are invited to keep the Passover, right? So the Passover is Yahweh's, it's God's Passover, and he invites all of his children to celebrate with him. I hope that makes sense, all right? So now, did they celebrate it in the New Testament? Well, let's see Jesus' Passover with his disciples. Luke chapter 22, verse 15. "Then he said to them, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." So what meal is Jesus getting ready to eat with his disciples? Passover, right? And then verse 19, it says, "And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Right? Do what in remembrance of Jesus? He's saying do the Passover in remembrance of Jesus, right? You're not going to remember it solely on the remembrance of Egypt anymore and your freedom from slavery to Egypt. Now, for the world, we're going to be remembering Jesus and the freedom from our slavery to sin, right? When you now celebrate the Passover Seder every year, you're not doing it just in remembrance of Egypt. You're now doing it in remembrance of me. So question, a lot of times I get asked, about celebrating the festivals and why my wife and I do this. And, well, aren't you being a little bit legalistic by trying to keep all those laws and festivals and all that? Like, why would you be doing that? Well, if I am being legalistic by wanting to celebrate the festivals of God with him, if I'm being legalistic, then So is Jesus here, because Jesus is commanding his disciples to be legalistic and celebrate the Passover every year, and now do this in remembrance of him, right? Well, I'm going to submit to you that Jesus is not being legalistic, and those who celebrate his festivals are not being legalistic. We're honoring God with what he's given to us. We're loving him. It's not being legalistic. We're loving God by keeping his commandments, just as First John tells us. If you love God, you'll keep his commandments. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Not if you want to be legalistic, you'll keep my commandments, right? We got saved so that we can walk as citizens of the kingdom. And one of the ways we do this is celebrating the festivals that God gives us, right? It's a party. It's something that's supposed to be special. It's a gift to us, guys. It's not legalism, okay? So Jesus celebrated the Passover with his disciples. Let's look at the rest of the New Testament era. Did the disciples, the apostles, the early church, did they continue celebrating the feast? 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6 through 8 says, your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast of Passover, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Paul is saying here to the Corinthian church, let us keep the feast of Passover, right? This is a primarily Gentile, congregation, it seems, some from the writings. And he's saying, let us celebrate the Passover, right? But we're going to do it in sincerity and in truth, right? Get rid of the wickedness out of your midst when we celebrate it, right? So this is what we need to remember, is that, again, they were keeping the feast of Passover, all right? Did Paul celebrate the feast? Acts chapter 18, this is on Paul's second missionary journey. And it says, when they asked him to stay a little longer with them, the Ephesus church, Paul did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, which is Passover here in the context. It says, but I will return again to you, God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus, right? So Paul left the mission field, didn't stay with this assembly here in Ephesus longer, because he had to be in Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of Passover. Why? Acts chapter 20, verse 16, this is the end of Paul's third missionary journey. And it says, for Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he would not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hurrying to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. So here's Paul leaving the mission field, okay, which it's not like us leaving the mission field today. He didn't just hop in a plane and a day later he happened to show up, in Jerusalem. And he's going to celebrate the feast, for a week, and then he's going to fly back, right, to the mission field. No, months in advance, he'd have to get on boats. He'd have to spend his money, the money that's being donated to him for the mission field, right, and the money that he's been earning. He's taking money from the mission field so he can travel back to Israel, back to Jerusalem, to celebrate the feast. Why was this so important to him? Because God commanded it, right? And not that he had to go back to Israel to celebrate the feast. Like, they were celebrating it, like in Corinth, like that verse we just read. In these assemblies, they couldn't just travel months at a time to go for every festival to Jerusalem, unless you lived nearby in the land of Judea at the time of the first century. But they were supposed to celebrate it. But Paul, there were several of these festivals that he sanctified specifically to the Lord, that he wanted to be there for the festival specifically. And he left the mission field in order to do that. And I think there's something so key about that. And again, also, Paul wrote Corinthians. These second and third missionary journey, when he did this, we're talking at least 20, 25 years after Jesus ascended. And Paul met the risen Jesus. He also lived in the Spirit. We have writings of him talking about being in the Spirit of God. He met Jesus face to face numerous times. And yet, after all this time, he still celebrated the festivals. Why? Right? I submit to you that Jesus didn't do away with the festivals or what we've been taught in church. In theology, we're supposed to be celebrating the festivals because God gave them to us and they speak to the redemption plan, right? But now the question that may be burning in your mind, well, didn't Jesus fulfill the festivals? Let's look into this, all right? Has Passover been fulfilled. Well, let me just ask this right away. Does fulfill mean to make done away with or to do away with? What is the definition even of fulfill, guys? We've totally had this messed up in our understanding, guys. Question number 2, did Jesus fulfill all love while he was here on earth? Most of us would say, yeah, of course Jesus fulfilled all love, right? Well, when he fulfilled all love, does that mean we don't love anymore because Jesus did it all, or he did away with love because he fulfilled it? No, that sounds so silly, right? Let's see in Jesus' own words in the Sermon on the Mount what he said in reference to the festivals of God and the law and all that. He says, "Do not think that I came to destroy," which destroy actually means to do away with. "Do not think that I came to destroy or do away with the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For surely I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law until all is fulfilled." So, what does it mean to be fulfilled, right? Let's look into this. Again, what did it mean for Jesus to fulfill all love? Well, Matthew 3:15, Jesus is with John getting ready to be baptized, and Jesus said to John, "Permit it to be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness." Right? What does it mean for Jesus to fulfill all righteousness? Does it mean that he did away with righteousness so we no longer walk in righteousness? No, that sounds so silly, right? Right? It means Jesus filled up in himself the full revelation of what righteousness was always meant to be, so that why? Why did he do that? And what's our response to him filling up to the fullness what righteousness is supposed to look like and what love is supposed to look like? Romans 8 chapter 3 verse 4, or chapter 8 verses 3 through 4 say, "For what the law could not do in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh on account of sin. He condemned sin in the flesh so that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit." So Jesus fulfilled all righteousness. Why? So that the righteous requirement of the law might now be fulfilled in us, right? And I submit that the righteous requirement of the law is love. It's walking in the fullness of love, not just being obedient, and meticulous about certain commandments. It's about filling up in ourselves the fullness of what love is always supposed to be, right? So he fulfilled in himself love and righteousness so that we fill up in ourselves love and righteousness. Matthew 5:19 says, "Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." So there is a such thing as least and greatest in the kingdom, right? And it says that least is defined as those who break one of the least of the commandments and teaches men to break them. But great is the one who does and teaches the commandments, okay? And he says, until heaven and earth pass away. Heaven and earth have not passed away yet, brethren. Heaven and earth have not passed away. He's coming to do that at the second coming, and after the millennial reign, we'll see a heaven and earth passing away into a new form, where paradise is going to come in, the new heavens and the new earth. But that has certainly not happened yet, brethren. So what does it mean then to be fulfilled? Jesus came to fill up to the full completion of what God's purposes always were for the festivals, right? He's wanting to fill up in himself the fullness of what the expression of celebrating these festivals was always meant to be and what it was always supposed to look forward to. The same thing when it says he filled up love, he fulfilled love and he fulfilled righteousness. Not so that we don't do it anymore, but he fulfilled it to show us the full extent of what love is supposed to look like and what righteousness is supposed to look like, so that we too can walk in the fullness of love and the fullness of righteousness. Does that make sense? I've said it a few different ways now, but multiple times. I hope that really makes sense in your mind, that fulfill does not mean to do away with, right? The law of God, without Jesus' interpretation, he's the living word of God. Without his interpretation, right, is not the law being filled up to the fullest of what God had always intended. So celebrating Passover and unleavened bread and trumpets and all these festivals, They're not being filled up to the fullest of what God always intended without the interpretation given to us by Jesus. Same thing with love, right? Right. I hope those really answered a lot of the myths surrounding maybe some of this. So, anyways, let's look just a little bit forward in history as well. Just one more slide on this. Polocrates of Ephesus, all right? He was the 8th bishop of Ephesus since the Apostle John, okay? And this is the year 196 AD, okay? So we're talking 150, 160 years since Jesus ascended, okay? And we're talking 100 years since John died, all right? John was the first bishop of Ephesus, okay? And this is an excerpt from a letter he wrote to the bishop Victor, the Bishop of Rome, concerning a discussion they were having on when to keep the Passover, right? Here's what he says. As for us, those of us in Ephesus, we scrupulously observe the exact day, neither adding nor taking away. These all, which the all there, he had listed a whole bunch of forefathers of the faith, including Philip and John, the apostles, right? Many of the bishops that followed in his stead, the following bishops of Ephesus, including the bishops in the surrounding area of Asia Minor and in the Middle East. He's saying these all kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month, which is on the Hebrew calendar, the 14th day of the month, in accordance with the gospel, without ever deviating from it, but keeping to the rule of faith. Notice he's saying here that they kept it. John, Philip, the apostles, and all the bishops leading up to this 8th bishop, 196 AD, they kept the Passover. They celebrated the Passover on the same day, the exact day on the 14th. And Polocrates here is saying they kept it in accordance with the gospel, not in accordance with the book of Exodus, not in accordance with the Old Testament. He's saying in accordance with the gospel, keeping it according to the rule of faith, right? Amazing, right? Faith is our obedience being expressed, okay? He's saying we're doing this now in remembrance of Jesus, not just the leaving of Egypt anymore, okay? So this is historical evidence that they were still celebrating Passover even up to the end of the 2nd century, going into the 3rd century. Okay. Now, communion, the Last Supper. When we do communion in our churches or at homes, okay, and I'm going to say this here, and just know that my wife and I, we still celebrate communion. We do it, generally, we do it every Friday night. We do it with our church family. We believe it's a very special tradition we should be doing as a body. It's really good. It bears a lot of fruit. However, the way that we celebrate communion in the Last Supper today, what we call the Last Supper, it evolved from the Roman Catholic Eucharist ceremony, okay? Which that evolved from the Passover ceremony, okay? That's where the ceremony comes from. Our taking a wafer or a piece of cracker and a little cup of juice or wine, that comes from the Roman Catholic Church, which evolved from the original Passover Seder, okay? Now, there's nothing wrong with communion, all right? There's nothing wrong with communion. However, we miss the significance of the meal that Jesus, the significance of this meal, the significance that Jesus wanted to get across to us as his church if we miss the Passover context. If we don't understand Passover, we're missing the context of which he gave us this meal, okay? Does that make sense? I'm not against communion, okay? But we need to understand where our traditions come from. And when Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me, he had a very specific context in mind. And it wasn't communion like we take it today. It is the Passover Seder. And I submit to you, if we understand the Passover, and especially in light of the things that I'm going to be sharing with you in this series, if we understand that, then the next time you take communion, oh, it's going to be amazing for you. If you really get this revelation, it is just going to blow you away. You're going to have so much fruit with the Lord. I bet the Spirit's going to be all over you because you're going to understand the context for what Jesus was speaking. Okay? So let's get into it. Where did the Passover start? So if you would, turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 through 17. That's where we're going to go ahead and be reading from. This is the context of the instructions that God was giving about the first Passover they were to celebrate, but also that they're going to continue celebrating Passover from year to year. All right. All right, so let's begin. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, "This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you." Okay, so now they're going to be learning about God's new calendar. Okay, and he's saying, the month you're in right now, this is the beginning of the month for you. All right. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, "On the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household." All right. So a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. So everyone who has a need for this Passover lamb, everyone's need is going to be met. And that means if you have to invite in some neighbors to do it with you, then do so. But you're going to celebrate this. And in the first century, Judaism, uh, basically a lamb being sacrificed had to have at least 10 persons who were going to be eating of it per lamb, all the way up to 20 people. Okay, so 10 to 20 people per lamb in the time of the first century is what they estimated would fulfill the need of this. To everyone gets to partake of the lamb. Keep some of this symbolism in mind as well, guys. Again, Jesus as our Passover lamb. I want you to keep some of this symbolism in mind and let God speak to you about some of this revelation. I'm going to be going into a lot of it in this series, but God may be speaking things to you that I won't even cover. So just keep your spiritual eyes and ears open as we read this. All right. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it unto the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight, and they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. Okay, so they're going to take the blood, they're going to put it on the doorposts of their houses, right? This is the only Passover that they were commanded to do that. In fact, every Passover from here forth, they're actually going to be specifically commanded, I think in Deuteronomy, never to put the blood on the doorpost again. The blood is only supposed to be offered at the place that God chooses, which would have been the temple. Okay, so we're not taking blood from lambs anymore and putting it on our doorpost as we celebrate Passover. That is against Scripture, okay? So they're going to eat the flesh on that same night, okay? It's going to be roasted in fire, and they're not to let any of it remain until morning, all right? Verse 11. And thus you shall eat it with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. All right. Again, Yahweh's Passover. It's our God's Passover. It says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night. I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt, I'm going to execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." So think about that. Keep the revelation in mind that when God passes by the blood of the lamb on the doorpost of their house, the plague is not going to touch them because God's going to pass over them to protect them. Okay? And verse 14, "So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance." Okay? Everlasting, right? He says everlasting here, not up until the time that Jesus comes, but an everlasting ordinance. All right? Keep that in mind. Verse 15, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Okay, now this is now going into what's called the Festival of Unleavened Bread, and I'm going to go into more detail about it in this series. But there's a 7-day festival of unleavened bread, and the first day of unleavened bread, it's actually that night prior to the beginning of unleavened bread that you would eat of the Passover lamb itself. So the Passover meal kicks off the 7-day festival where you're only during that festival, you're not allowed to eat any bread with leaven in it. You have to eat unleavened bread. Okay, so keep in mind some of the scriptures you've read about what leaven is. All right. On the first day, you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. All right. So you're not allowed to eat any leaven during that 7-day festival. And if you do, you'll be cut off from Israel. That's how serious this command was to be taken. No leaven. Okay. On the first day, there shall be a holy convocation. And on the seventh day, there shall be a holy convocation for you. Right? No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. Right? So it's supposed to be like we think of weekends today. They're basically Sabbaths. No work is to be done on these days, okay, except for prepping your food. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on the same day I have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. So twice God has said that's to be an everlasting ordinance, right? So the Passover feast so far. An unblemished lamb was chosen on the 10th day of the first month. All right. And in the first century Israel, all the people, when they came to Jerusalem to celebrate, they would all take their lambs and they would parade them through the streets. And even the lamb for the nation, if you will, they would parade it. The high priest and the religious leaders, they would parade the lamb for the nation. They would parade it through the streets of Jerusalem on the 10th day. Keep that in mind, all right, as we get into the New Testament. They inspected the lamb for 4 days. So each household would keep the lamb. They would make sure that there was no blemishes. They would inspect it for any blemishes. And then they would sacrifice it on the 14th day that afternoon, roughly between the time of 3 to 6 p.m. And then the first Passover was the Passover that they took the blood and they put it on their doorposts. And again, it was only for the first Passover. They never did that again. The entire festival of unleavened bread, it starts on the evening of the 14th, okay? So at nighttime on the 14th day, but technically that begins the 15th day of the first month, okay? It begins the 15th because, and I'm going to show you an image here. I think it's the next slide. I'll show you this to you, but actually I'll just show you to you right now. I know it's kind of blurry here. Here's my pointer. But so basically, a day started at nighttime, okay? I know it sounds kind of weird, but days actually started at sundown, and they would run night and day to sundown, okay? Night and day to sundown. So night, day, that's one day, all right? And darkness and daytime. That goes back to the book of Genesis where God says night and day, the first day, right? Or evening and morning, the first day. Okay, same thing, all right? So on the 14th, they would slaughter the lamb in the afternoon. They would cook it, and then at nighttime, they would eat the lamb, all right? And this actually became the 15th day of the month, started at nighttime, and it would go into the daytime. And so this is what it's talking about here when it says it begins the 15th of the first month, okay? It starts unleavened bread. The whole 7-day festival starts on the evening of the 14th, the evening, right? Starts here, and it's going to continue on for 7 days. But it kicks off with you eating the Passover meal here at nighttime, okay? Hope that makes sense. And it's going to last for 7 days until sundown on the 21st day, which is actually the day we're on right now in our modern day. The day that I'm recording this is actually the 7th day of the festival of unleavened bread. So I'm not doing any work on this day. I'm just celebrating with the Lord. Had an awesome time with him this morning in my prayer closet, and he's teaching me so much, speaking so much about the times we're living in and what he wants for us specifically in our life. So it's really a great time to meet with him. And he actually told me this Passover, he didn't want me to go anywhere. He wanted me to stay and meet with him and do this Passover with him. Because usually we go and we celebrate with family and friends. And but this year he told me to celebrate with him specifically. That was before I knew the extent of what this corona was going to do. And just so amazing. He wanted me to celebrate with him and not go anywhere. And then realize I can't go anywhere anyway. So I knew that I was hearing from him. So really awesome. All right, so the first day of the festival, the 15th, and the 7th day, the 21st, are called high Sabbaths, okay? So they're going to be treated as weekends with no work to be done. And I'm sorry for the little display at the bottom. But it says, for 7 days there shall be no leaven in one's dwelling. Okay, so all leaven has to be removed from your home. All right. And again, this is kind of a blurry map. I'm so sorry for this, but I hope it kind of makes sense. I just want to give you an idea of a little bit of the festival, what it looks like, that they would eat the lamb here. It would be eaten overnight. I'm sorry, they sacrificed and cooked the lamb here. It would be eaten overnight. And the next day, they actually began to leave for the Exodus. Okay. They gathered their belongings. They didn't have time to cook any bread. So they took their unleavened bread and they entered into the Exodus. All right. And the festival continued just like it does today. All right. Hope that makes sense. Here's a few more details. Exodus chapter 12, verse 19 says, whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger, which is a Gentile who lives among God's people, or a native of the land. So what is a stranger? The Hebrew word there is ger. Okay, it's the word ger in Hebrew. And basically it's kind of the idea of our green card citizens today in America. All right, we have people who come from other nations and they want to be a citizen. They end up getting a green card. They get approved. They're not yet full-fledged citizens. They're green card citizens. It means that they have some immunity to our laws because they haven't yet learned what it means to live as a citizen. So they're in the process of learning about our customs in America, our language, the laws of the land. They're getting to learn these things. So they're not held to the same strict accountability as a full citizen is. Okay. And that's what he's speaking here. Is a stranger, a ger. It basically means a Gentile who's chosen to become among God's people and be a part of God's kingdom, but they're not yet a full-fledged Israelite, or what the Bible defines here as a native of the land. Okay, so I hope that makes sense here. But he's saying here, whoever eats what is leavened, all right, that person shall be cut off, whether he is a ger or a native of the land. So even the Gentiles who attach themselves to Israel here, they want to be part of the kingdom of God. They too are supposed to not have any leaven in their homes during the festival of unleavened bread, meaning that they will be celebrating and observing the festival of unleavened bread. All right? All right? They're just not supposed to have any leaven in their homes. Okay? Exodus chapter 12, verse 37 through 38 says, then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them also, with flocks and herds, a great deal of livestock. So many scholars actually estimate that roughly the amount of Israelites who came out, double that amount for how many Gentiles came out with them. And I think I have a slide in here on this, but most of the people who came out of Egypt, again, they were Gentiles. A lot of people were slave people to Egypt from other nations around the world. And they all, as shockingly as this may be, they were all called Hebrews. Okay? Hebrew wasn't just a name for Abraham or the children of Abraham or for Israel. Hebrew in the ancient world, we get that from the ancient, I think it's Aramaic, aparu. And basically it just meant a landless person, someone who wasn't a citizen of a nation. They had no land. They had no inheritance. They were a landless people, right? They were just kind of roamed. They worked. They were day laborers. And many people in Egypt were, and many Gentiles included, were these types of slaves, all right? And so many of the Hebrews, God came to rescue the Hebrews. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they're the ones of the flesh who've partaken of this God. This is their God, but we get to surround them and we become part of Israel as the Gentiles who come in, the Gentiles who have no inheritance in the world to come. Now we have an inheritance through the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through Jesus Christ. We attach ourselves to Israel. Okay, I hope that makes sense. But what I wanted to get through here is that it's a mixed multitude who went up with them also. Flocks and herds and a great deal of livestock. So it was a mixed multitude who went up with them. Okay? Again, most of the people who came out of Egypt were mixed multitude. They were Gentiles. They were not Israelites. Okay? And then towards the end of Exodus chapter 12, it says, all the congregation of Israel shall keep it, talking about the Passover. It says, and when a stranger, a ger again, right, this Gentile convert, this green card citizen, When he dwells with you and he wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, all right? So right now we know that a ger, it has to celebrate the festival of unleavened bread with no leaven in his house, or he'll be cut off. Okay, so he celebrates the festival of he celebrates the festival of unleavened bread, but he is not allowed to celebrate the Passover. He's not allowed to eat the Passover meal, okay? But if he wants to eat the Passover meal, all his males must be circumcised. Then he can come near and keep it, and then he shall be as a native of the land. All right? For no uncircumcised person is allowed to eat of the Passover. One law shall be for the native born and for the ger, the stranger who dwells among you. Okay? The Gentile who dwells among you that, is a citizen of the kingdom. So what are we talking about here, guys? So keep this in mind too when we get to the significance of the new covenant. You can't eat of the lamb, the Passover lamb, unless you are circumcised. Here it's circumcised of flesh. We're going to get to what he's talking about when it means to coming to Jesus as our Passover lamb and what it means to partake of him. We have to be circumcised in order to fully partake of the lamb, or we'll be cut off. Okay, it's an abomination to God. He says it's an abomination elsewhere in Scripture. Okay, and when you partake of it, when a Gentile partakes of the Passover, it is their rite of passage into becoming a full-fledged citizen. Okay, so like in America, green card citizens, green card immigrants, when they want to become a full-fledged citizen, they've gone through however many years it takes for them to learn the culture and the laws and all that. They get through all their classes. When they're ready, they go through some kind of a ceremony, right, where they raise their right hand and they swear, they pledge allegiance to the United States of America. And now they become as a citizen of the land. No longer are they green card citizens. No longer are they different or are they separated in any way from you and I as citizens. Same thing with Israel. It was the Passover meal that took one from being an outsider, an immigrant to the land, an immigrant to the nation, to become now a full-fledged citizen of the nation. It's the Passover meal. But you have to be circumcised to keep the Passover. That's God's laws here, okay? I say this, and he says, one law shall be for the native born and for the stranger who dwells among you, okay? So I read that to say that we must be circumcised to keep God's Passover. So what I'm going to go ahead and do, because we're almost at the hour mark, I'm going to go ahead and end this video right here as part 1. And when we come back, we're going to go into more details about Passover itself, the language of Passover, the first century context, of why we needed a new Passover lamb anyways, and we're going to start bringing Jesus into this, and we're going to understand the significance of Jesus as our Passover lamb. So God bless.